Love him or hate him, you can't quite resist the allure of Nick Cage. He's like a landmine made of chocolate. From quirky indie pics to full-throttle actioners, it seems pegging down exactly what Cage does as an actor is all but impossible. Sadly, thanks to some wayward career choices, perhaps motivated by his unfortunate financial situation, recently this has been easier to guess. What he does is make poor movies with a few all too sparse flashes of brilliance. More interestingly, there are a number of films he came close to being cast in, and a number of these went on to be big successes, something that likely wouldn't have happened with Nick Cage in a starring role. As such, I'm Ben from What Culture, and here are 10 movies that were almost ruined by Nicolas Cage. Number 10. Dumb and Dumber. It's hard to imagine anyone but Jim Carrey and Jeff Daniels in the titular roles of this madcap comedy, but while Carrey was always nailed down, Daniels' casting came later, and according to interviews with Cage, Carrey and he wanted to work together, and the rubber-faced mask star had specifically earmarked Dumb and Dumber as the project. Cage has never really shown the broad comedic chops necessary for Harry, while Daniels proved to be the perfect foil to Jim Carrey. Thankfully for everyone involved, Cage passed, and went on to work on Leaving Las Vegas instead, bagging an Oscar in the process. Number 9. John Woo's He-Man. Back in the middle of the last decade, John Woo was reportedly trying to get a new He-Man movie made, ignoring the fact that the character was about as irrelevant as could possibly be. Woo was said to want Sex and the City star Jason Lewis to play his blonde bombshell, as well as Nick Cage, who he'd worked with on Face Off, for Skeletor. Rumor has it that Cage couldn't commit because he was already playing a skeleton-type character for Ghost Rider, which is obviously one too many. The very idea of Cage trying to play a camp, over-the-top villain without so much as a hint of irony is bone-chillingly perverse. Let's all just be quietly glad that Woo never got this one off the ground. Number 8. Tarsem Singh's Hellblazer. Back before Francis Lawrence and Reeves teamed up to basically drag one of the finest comic book properties of all time through a puddle of shit, zany, visionary, terrible director Tarsem Singh was attached to direct, with Cage playing the Liverpudlian Demon Slayer. Yes. But Singh and Cage both ended up leaving the project, as it seems the director never actually wanted to work with Cage as the star, saying he couldn't make the film he wanted with Cage involved. What a dick. Keanu Reeves did do a pretty good job of convincing everyone that Constantine wasn't the perfect material for adaptation we all suspected it was, but it's difficult not to think Cage in the lead would have been even worse. Number 7. Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Looking at Cage's recent output, it's remarkably odd to note that Charlie Kaufman actually wrote Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind with the Con Air star in mind, and not Jim Carrey. In the end, Cage graciously let Carrey have the part, giving us one of the actor's finest roles to date. Cage has spent the time since adaptation coming out seemingly attempting to wipe out any suspicions that he might be able to pull off a similar role again. Number 6. The Breakfast Club. Back before Cage had his big movie break, he was playing an assortment of tough guy roles, and he was in the early running to continue this form for John Hughes in the soon-to-be classic The Breakfast Club. In the end, Judd Nelson bagged the juiciest role of the entire production, fending off interest from castmate Emilio Estevez and John Cusack, and committing an icon to screen. Back in the early days, Cage wasn't actually very good. The Breakfast Club would have come too early, and would probably have been treated to another gawky, discomforting performance rather than the pitch-perfect douchery that Nelson offered. Number 5. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. In 1999, back before Tim Burton was given the reins to try and ruin Roald Dahl's most famous of children's books, Cage was under discussion for the key role of Willy Wonka in another adaptation, but he lost interest, which was undoubtedly for the best. You see, anyone who plays Willy Wonka has to stand up to Gene Wilder's portrayal, and it's implausible to imagine Cage attempting to channel the impish mischief that underbeds Wilder's performance. There's also a very real suggestion that Cage would have brought a lot more physical presence to the role, perhaps reinforcing a little too much the factory owner's darker side, his slave-owning and his mistreatment of children. And in that context, the idea of Cage attempting to bring his own touch to the character is almost criminally disturbing. Hooray! Number 4. The Matrix. Everyone knows that Will Smith turned down Neo in order to make Wild Wild West, because of course he did, but what was less widely known, until Cage confirmed it himself, is that he was also up for the role too. Ultimately, Cage turned down the chance of the part because of the filming commitments in Australia. While Keanu Reeves isn't exactly the greatest actor in the world, for that first movie, he was pretty perfectly cast. Subsequently, of course, Reeves' crippling lack of emotional range turned a superhero lead into a walking mannequin who nobody really cared about, and we all started to secretly wish that Will Smith had actually taken on the role. But not Nick Cage. He'd probably have done the same thing as Reeves, but without the cooler notes of the first film. I suppose you could say he would have been a shit Neo for whackers. Hashtag shit Neo for whackers. Number 3. The Lord of the Rings. Cage has stated he was offered the role of Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings, but like The Matrix, it's another one he turned down because of the mammoth filming commitment. Sounding like a pretty shitty excuse now, Nick. Ultimately, Stuart Townsend was cast in the role before rather unceremoniously being fired after 2 months of training because he looked too young, and being replaced by Viggo Mortensen, whose performance is arguably the finest of the entire franchise. And there's no way Cage could have maintained the almost ethereal regality that Mortensen brought to the role. Number 2. Batman. Unthinkably, but now infamously, Joel Schumacher was optioned to make a third Batman film despite the fact that Batman and Robin was a f***ing travesty. There's quite a lot of information available online dedicated to the would-be Batman triumphant, and one of the most widely shared, and awfully intriguing, is the fact that Nick Cage was set for the villain role, probably as the Scarecrow. Like the Willy Wonka almost casting, the Scarecrow would have required something that just isn't in Cage's range. Had Schumacher made Batman triumphant, there's very little suggestion that he would have gone with the restrained take on Dr. Crane that Chris Nolan's writing team eventually came up with, and we would have probably seen something more along the lines of Two-Face or the Joker, but just in different clothes. Number 1. Superman Lives. Cage is legitimately a Superman nut. He named his child Kal-El, which is a normal thing to do, and the revelation that he wasn't going to play Superman must have hit him harder than any of the other near castings on this list. Cage would have been a new Superman, a different Superman, and quite possibly a weird Superman. It's safe to say the collapse of the project was a mercy, and even Cage concedes some positives have come out of it. Eventually, Brandon Routh was cast instead, with the film repackaged as Superman Returns. Superman actors need a certain intangible grace about them to be successful, and Cage would have been neither the Superman we wanted, regardless of how entertaining it might have been, or the one we needed. And that's our list. Are there any near devastating Cage castings we missed off? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. You can even follow me here on Twitter if you fancy. I'm Ben from What Culture, and thanks for watching.